Good morning. My name is Mark Andrews from Rightcheck. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar this morning, when we will be exploring the issue of compliance with right to work legislation and in particular what this means for an SME organisation. So to start with, let's consider the risk that is posed by this legislation and non-compliance. The legislation itself has been with us for almost 10 years now, and it does apply to all organisations. So regardless of your size or your industry sector, then right to work legislation is something that must be conducted for the recruitment of all employees. The legislation has evolved over the years, so it has changed in respect of its reach, in respect of the complexity and the processing that is required to arrive at a compliant right to work check. And alongside that, the penalties and fines concerned with non-compliance have also risen quite significantly. Last year, the government issued over £30 million in fines, and this was to a wide range of SME organisations. What the government also does by the Home Office is to issue in effect, a name and shame list of organisations that have unfortunately fallen foul of this legislation. Now, clearly, the implications for a business, in particular an SME, that is hit by a financial penalty and also hit by the publicity surrounding the non-compliance with this legislation, that can be a very dire situation for the organisation concerned. And what I'd like to go on to now is to talk about some of the ways that organisations have inadvertently found themselves falling foul of this legislation. So the first area that we come across probably most frequently in terms of situations where organisations find themselves in a non-compliant position is where they ask the individual, the candidate, to scan or photocopy copies of their ID documentation, their passport, etc., and to simply email or bring that into interview with them. Now, this is a fundamental breach of the legislation. You, as an employer, are required to view original documentation, so you must view the candidate's actual ID documentation. It's just not acceptable to look at scans or photocopies. The second area that to consider is that of outsourcing. Now, this could be a situation where a recruitment consultant or an agency assures you that a right to work check has been conducted on a candidate and you go ahead and proceed and employ the individual concerned. Now, this is non-compliant because the onus of responsibility is firmly placed on the shoulders of the employer to be the individual that conducts the right to work check on the candidate. It's simply not acceptable to outsource this task. Thirdly, there is the misconception that this is something that can be conducted post-recruitment. So once the individual has in fact started work and maybe a few days or a week into employment, that the employer then conducts the right to work check at that point in proceedings. Now, again, this is something that is very clearly non-compliant. A right to work check is something that must be conducted prior to recruitment. Several organisations will actually conduct this at a very early stage, even at first interview, just to ensure that it is something that has been addressed and does not impede the recruitment process at a later stage. Fourthly, there is the assumption that this is something that does not apply to a particular individual. It may well be that you have a sponsored student or a work placement or a part-time or temporary worker The bottom line is that if somebody is actually going to be working within your organisation, then you have a responsibility to conduct a right to work check on that individual, regardless of the contractual status of that individual concerned. Now, as I've mentioned, right to work legislation is something that's been with us for some years. And over the passage of time, the process under which you need to check a candidate's right to work status and the documentation that needs to be viewed has changed. It is something that you need to be aware of and aware of current legislation and be aware of what documents are applicable and can be used to validate right to work status. A popular misconception, just to give you one example, is that a driving licence is adequate, which in fact in isolation it is not. So yes, it is vital that you are aware of what is the right documentation to be checked for a particular candidate's circumstances. Okay, so let's now turn our attention to one or two areas that can result in non-compliance even if it appears that a right to work check has actually been conducted. The first area to look at is one of audit. If you were to receive a visit from the Home Office, which can happen without notice, then one of the things that they would be expecting to see is that there is an acceptable audit trail of the checks that have been undertaken, when they were conducted, who conducted them, and the process that was followed to ensure that the check was conducted correctly. So it is vital that you have that evidence and you have that material available to present on demand as may be required. The next area to consider, which is obviously a recent development, is that of GDPR. And whilst you have a legal right, a legal obligation to hold a candidate's personal information and personal data, then it needs to be recognised that you are nevertheless handling sensitive data. Photocopies of passports, birth certificates, etc. all come under what is classified as sensitive personal information from a GDPR perspective. And as such, you need to ensure that you have a very robust method to look after that data, whether it's photocopies or scans of this information. It must be looked after within your organisation to ensure that you do not breach any of the principles of the GDPR legislation. So the final area just to consider briefly, given it is the season of Halloween, is one of ghosting. Now, there is a serious element to this issue. Unfortunately, it is the case in the UK that there are individuals who will in some way share ID documentation, and the individual that turns up for interview may not be the same as the individual that actually starts on day one. Now, this just highlights the need for you as an organisation to ensure that you've got a very rigorous process in place to conduct these right to work checks to avoid a situation where your organisation falls victim of this unfortunate situation. So in summary, I would just like to draw out the areas that are critical when conducting these right to work checks within your organisation. Firstly, the candidate must be present at the point the check is being conducted. They must share with you and you must view and check their original ID documentation. It must be yourself that is undertaking the check. It cannot be outsourced or left to a recruitment agency to do this on your behalf. And lastly, the person that is your employee that is charged with doing this check, they must be absolutely familiar and aware of the current legislation and the process that they need to follow. This will give you protection in the form of a statutory excuse and a compliant right to work check. So Rightcheck have looked at this challenge, looked at the issues that you may face, and we have got a mobile app-based solution that can make this whole process very easy for you. It will guide the recruiter through the right approach to follow, regardless of the nationality or the circumstances of the individual candidate that they are facing. And it will avoid you making costly errors and mistakes, which we've talked about within this webinar, that can so easily occur. All of the logic that is built into Rightcheck is automatically updated. So as and when legislation changes, there is no need for you to monitor that situation or indeed train people within your organisation. That is all incorporated within Rightcheck. And lastly, you will get automatic alerts if there are rechecks that are required to be undertaken, which can be the case in respect of visas or other documentation which will expire, and you will need to conduct rechecks. The mobile app makes the process very simple. It can be conducted in a very brief period of time, and it will give you the statutory excuse that you require. Now, the app will operate on Android and on Apple devices. Everything is encrypted, so there is nothing stored within the device itself. So it is fully GDPR compliant, and as such, it can be deployed on a company device, a company mobile device, or indeed, if you have a situation where employees are using their own mobile device, then the app has been designed to operate in that situation as well. So once the check has been completed via the Rightcheck app, then it is securely transmitted to the Rightcheck management portal, which is a cloud-based portal. And this gives you centrally the control over the activity that is being undertaken. It allows you to assign. So once the check has been completed via the app, then it is submitted to the Rightcheck management portal, which is a secure cloud-based portal where the check is stored. Via the portal, you can get alerts of any documents that are expiring, that are requiring your attention. You have the ability to be able to manage employees that leave the organisation, and you also have the ability to manage access to the app for people, employees that are charged with recruitment within your organisation. And this is the area that will give you the audit trail of the checks that have been conducted. So thank you for joining us today. I hope it's been of use and you have found the information will be helpful to you in looking at right to work legislation and the way that your organisation is ensuring compliance. Should you need any more help or guidance, then do of course make contact with us. We'd be delighted to help you. If you visit rightcheck.io, you'll find all our contact details there, and you will find more information about the legislation. You'll also notice that Rightcheck is available in a business solution. This is a pay-as-you-go model that is available to you, that you can download the app and simply buy check credits as and when your organisation requires them for the recruitment that you're undertaking. Thank you very much and goodbye.